you know, the reason that we're having this conversation, the reason that we've asked you to talk to this audience is, you know, this is a group who are, I would say, remarkably well informed about the challenges that we face in the world, and people who not only understand sort of the daunting nature of the challenges ahead, but also are very aware that we're in this for the long haul.
Right.
You know, and so you have gained a lot of wisdom over the years that we feel can be very valuable to this particular audience, especially in your insights in gaining emotional and spiritual resilience in the face of all of this. It's very challenging. Facing the collapse of industrial civilization, as you say, and abrupt climate change, and creating lifeboats for navigating these very turbulent times. So we look forward to hearing what you have to offer for this particular audience.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for giving me this opportunity to speak with you on this topic today, which is really about building that emotional and spiritual resilience at what I call the end of business as usual. As you know, I've written a number of books on this topic, all of which everyone can learn more about at my website, carolynbaker.net.
How many books have you written now, Carolyn?
Well, I'm on my 11th one, but it's really the last 6 or so that pertain to collapse and abrupt climate change.
Yeah.
So today I'd like to share some of the most recent insights I have on the topic of the end of business as usual. I'm sharing some ideas from my own work and from my collaboration with my colleague Dean Walker in Ashland, Oregon, who's in the process of publishing a book entitled The Impossible Conversation, Choosing Resilience and Reconnection at the End of Business as Usual. And it's a very powerful book on the many reasons that our culture, for the most part, can't talk about climate change in much depth or even with much honesty. And the fundamental reason we can't talk about it has to do with how we got here, how we got to this place of climate madness. And in fact, talking about how we got here, by definition, clearly demonstrates what we would need in order to mitigate climate change, and that changes how we relate to everyone and everything in our lives. But before we explore how our total awakeness to climate change changes how we live our lives, I want to spend just a short time talking about some of the sober data regarding climate change that most people are not hearing about. I think we have to remember that the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a very conservative organization, and many of the findings that they've released have been vetted by corporations. There are many steep limitations baked into what they can make public. And therefore, it's very important to expand our horizons. So I want to suggest that you take a look at a compilation of findings by conservation biologist Guy McPherson, Professor Emeritus, University of Arizona, who's amassed some of the most daunting research, including, but beyond that, of the IPCC.
Carolyn, I'm going to stop you for a moment.
Yeah, my video goes in and out sometimes, so I'll be aware of that and fix it when I can.
Okay, let's just go back to where you began to talk about the IPCC.
Sure. Just a moment. I think we need to remember the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a very conservative organization. Mm-hmm. And many of the findings that they've released have been vetted by corporations. There are many steep limitations baked into what they can make public, and therefore it's very important to expand our horizons. So I want to suggest that you take a look at the compilation of findings by conservation biologist Guy McPherson, Professor Emeritus, University of Arizona, who's amassed some of the most daunting research, including, but beyond that, of the IPCC. And you can see his research online at guymcpherson.com. It's at a website called Nature Bats Last. And also in 2014, Guy and I wrote a book of conversations entitled Extinction Dialogues, How to Live with Death in Mind, in which he expounded on the climate science aspect of the situation, and I addressed the existential implications of that science. And curiously, we released our book just shortly after Elizabeth Kolbert released her best-selling book, The Sixth Extinction. Now, the daunting punchline of Guy McPherson's research is that by combing through reams of data and projections from current studies in global climate science, he estimates that Earth is likely to be experiencing average temperatures of between 3 degrees centigrade or Celsius and 5 Celsius by 2030 to 2050. At the center of his assessment of our world is the assertion that a global temperature rise of 3°C or more in less than 100 years would be too fast and too radical a change in habitat for the plants upon which all species rely for food, oxygen, and everything else, really. So it's probably important to mention here that many abrupt climate change advocates, including Guy McPherson, assert that there's been no human life on Earth with a temperature above 3.5 C. And a viewing of one of many of his YouTube presentations will also detail his assertion that years before, the years between now and 2030 or 2050 promise to be a progressive downhill slide regarding the the capacity to inhabit Earth for us and millions of other species. Now, I'm providing for this talk today an electronic handout with a summary of the sober data that Dean Walker has compiled in his forthcoming book, The Impossible Conversation. And obviously today in this presentation, I'm borrowing a part of his subtitle with permission, because I'm talking about the end of business as usual. You can look at the handout later, but I want to move on now with the presentation. As you all know, we now have a presidential administration in America that, well, it really appears to be hell-bent on destroying what remains of planet Earth. And the very small window that we had between now and the potential extinction of life on Earth has gotten a whole lot smaller in just the last 3 months. So all of that said, let's move on to a deeper explanation of what I call sharpening our tools for apocalypse, because we're going to need these tools more than we can possibly imagine. And I will be bringing all of this back around to food, so bear with me. First of all, I'd like to talk about the most fundamental of all causes, from my perspective, of why we are now living in climate chaos and why it's now almost impossible to have an intelligent conversation about climate change without the topic of extinction coming up. And that fundamental cause has to do with relationship, or connection, if you prefer that word. Almost all businesses in the past and current business that we're dealing with right now, of course, in the 21st century, has been created not through relationship. Relationship is not much of a part of modern business, obviously. Businesses have been created, by and large, through extraction. And extraction is the absolute opposite of connection or relationship, because it's inherently a use relationship. Connection, on the other hand, is about intimacy, not use. Now, to clarify, let's briefly consider another perspective, which is the indigenous perspective. From the indigenous perspective, there is no separation between me and the mountains or the rocks or the trees or the river or any living beings. And in contrast with the industrial perspective of conquest, use, and profit, there's obviously a huge difference. And this has certainly been brought home to us sort of in high definition broadcasting in the sky by the Standing Rock protests of last winter. In those protests, we saw people who are willing to die for their relationship with water and land. Now, industrial growth society cannot comprehend that kind of relationship, and so the protests were, distorted by the media as a conflict based on rights or culture or historical grudges, and there were certainly some aspects of that involved, but it was really about the prevention of an industry from making a profit and this enormous respect that indigenous people have for the land. So I'd like to go back to that word connection. What do I really mean by connection? I'm talking about the three most fundamental connections possible. Connection with oneself, with the other, and with earth. And when I say self, I mean the sacred self, the divine within, our sacred core. And when I say other, I mean all living beings, and connection with them means recognizing and living as if there were absolutely no separation between us. And when I say connection with earth, I don't mean that we go hiking or camping once in a while and enjoy being in nature. I mean that we increasingly come to understand that we and the earth are one being, that I am the earth, and the earth is me. Much of my work these days, and the work with Dean Walker that he and I are doing, is about deeply exploring the territory of reconnecting with self, other, and earth, because we believe that unless these are addressed, everything else is just business as usual. So in order to commodify the world, which is what almost all business on earth is about, we had to disconnect, or what Dean Walker calls override. Override means commodification as opposed to connection. Overriding especially relationship. This means that the real business genius, the smartest guys in the room, or the smartest guy in the room, is the one who can feel the least about extraction, who can feel the least about taking 5,000 jobs to another country, or who can feel the least about privatizing every social safety net and every institution that's designed to provide public service at public expense. That's what business genius in the current iteration of industrial civilization looks like. But we need to look at the cost of that override. When we override, when we disconnect from self, other, and earth, we create a blind spot. And I want to share some assumptions here, and I'm going to ask you to join with me a little bit on these assumptions. I ask you to join me in looking at how business works in the world today. I think we can generally agree that business is the dominant force in the world. But in order to be successful in business, you have to play the game by the rules. And one rule is maximizing profit. The assumption is that a state of perpetual growth is necessary in order to have a healthy business. This is based on the delusion that we can have infinite growth on a finite planet. And if this assumption is so, and maximizing profit is a core definition of a successful business, then if, for example, one wants to be, just one example, a coach for executives or small businesses, the model is that the person who creates the most profit is the most successful. The most successful coach is the one that inspires the most profit and growth for an industry. This is business as usual. Now, you might run a business and you might say, well, I don't want to do that. I want my business to be purpose-driven and be of service in the world. But even with those motives, the bottom line is the bottom line. And the players that win the most in the business as usual format are the ones that override relationship in favor of commodification. Now, if you think about it, it's really been since the 1960s or 70s that we've taken the foundation of commodification and extraction and jacked it up off the charts. During these decades, we created the biggest emissions of CO2 and the greatest extractions on Earth. And let's remember, in the business as usual model, maximum success is about maximum extraction. So let's take a breath. Here's where we need to tell the truth about how we've created the biggest free lunch that has ever happened on Earth. We've all ridden this wave of fossil fuel use, brought all of our ingenuity to it, and have maximized extraction beyond anything the human species has ever done. And the only metric we've used is profit. Our blind spot is that we've killed ourselves and other species, and we're on the way to total systems collapse and near-term human extinction because we've disconnected from ourselves, from others, and from Earth. And here's the problem with the blind spot. When there's a blind spot, since nature abhors a vacuum, the shadow will find its way into that spot. Now, what is the shadow? Well, I'd like to give you a brief definition of the shadow. Very briefly, the shadow is any part of us that doesn't match with our ego image of ourselves and that we unconsciously send away and we say, that's not me. I'm not a dishonest person. I'm not greedy. I'm not an opportunist. My lifestyle is earth-friendly. After all, I'm a farmer or I'm an activist or whatever. Now, there's a personal shadow, which I've just defined very briefly, and there's a collective shadow, which includes nations, cultures, and communities that essentially agree unconsciously that whatever bad behavior of the other group one is talking about, that nation or culture or community says, that's not us. We're not terrorists. We only kill people justifiably and with good reason because we're the good guys. We can bomb another country because somebody there used chemical weapons. We can drop the mother of all bombs because we need to scare the bad guys. Whatever we do is okay because we're the good guys. Now, I go into this in more depth in my book, Dark Gold, The Human Shadow and the Global Crisis. I talk in that book about the dynamics of the personal and collective shadows. And Dean Walker and I are going to be offering an online course later this year on the shadow. But the main point is that in this vacuum of disconnection that we've been looking at, the collective shadow is going to show up as well as the personal one in this blind spot. It's very important to understand that the personal and collective shadows are intertwined, inextricably connected. We can't just say, well, I just want to talk about my personal shadow and not the collective one, or vice versa. As you become more familiar with shadow work, that becomes increasingly clear. So one of the greatest manifestations of the human shadow has been colonization. We live in a country that was colonized more than 500 years ago, and the influence of that colonization is not only still with us, but seems to be intensifying day by day. Not only were indigenous people colonized, but non-indigenous people as well, colonized by the mentality of industrial civilization, so that after 500 years, we're all desperately needing to decolonize the industrial self. And of course, the industrial self shows up everywhere, but perhaps no more blatantly than in meeting the most fundamental of our human needs, eating. Now, I'm sure that some of you are familiar with Professor John Eichard's article, Reclaiming the Sacred in Food and Farming. He's the Emeritus Professor of Agriculture and Economics at the University of Missouri, and he writes about the spirituality of sustainable agriculture. And he asks, what is this thing called spirituality? And he proceeds to quote statements defining spirituality from a variety of cultures, but he summarizes them by saying, and this is a quote from John Eichertz, a common thread of all these expressions of spirituality is the existence of an unseen order or interconnected web that defines the oneness of all things into a unified whole. We as people are part of this whole. We may attempt to understand it and even influence it, but we did not create nor can we control it. Thus, we must seek peace through harmony within the order of things beyond our control. This harmony may be defined as doing the right things. And by doing the right things for ourselves, for others around us, and those of future generations, we create harmony and find inner peace. The sacred within us instinctively resonates with the sanctity of food. Therefore, the growing, transporting, distribution, and consumption of food are sacred acts that deserve ritual and reverence from the moment the seed is planted in the earth to the moment we have washed and put away the plate on which our food was served. End of quote from John Eichertz. You may also be familiar with Professor Peter Boland's article, The Sacrament of Food, in which he says that maybe the most sacred space in your home is not the yoga room or the altar with the candle or the chair by the window where you meditate and pray. Maybe the most sacred room in your house is the kitchen. But our interaction with food begins far in advance of preparing it in the kitchen. And Boland gives some suggestions for cultivating a more mindful reverence in our relationship with food. And I'm sure that you're familiar with some of these. First, know exactly where your food comes from. Read labels, ask questions, and research sources for whole organic foods in your region. Secondly, consider becoming a community-supported agriculture member, which allows you to buy directly from the farmer or grower. Third, give thanks when you shop. Thank the food you purchase. Thank the market staff, and give thanks that you can afford to shop. Fourth, commit to purchasing 10% or more of the food of your food grown locally. Fifth, mindfully plan your meals. Perhaps it won't be possible for you to eat at home today or tomorrow or the next day because you're traveling or because of time constraints. But plan a strategy for eating in places where nourishing food is served, or plan to bring healthy food or snacks with you. Sixth, take a moment or two to stop before eating and give thanks for your food. Remember to thank the people who grew, harvested, transported, and distributed your food. Thank plants and animals for their lives and the sacrifice they made with their lives so you can be fed. 7, regularly enjoy food with family and friends. Cook and eat meals together. Share the sacrament of food with each other in potlucks or other gatherings. And 8, occasionally share extra food or leftovers with neighbors or people who are not in your family or circle of friends. In a world of skyrocketing food prices and climate change, food security may become increasingly insecure, and sharing food with others communicates a subtle message that you're concerned about their well-being in hard times. And so reaching out in this way encourages reciprocity around food, so that when someone has little or no food, others are more motivated to share. Now, while eating is a political and economic act, it's also a sacrament, according to Boland. How we eat matters not only to ourselves, but to everyone else. And as Boland says, the way we eat is the way we live. How we eat is who we are. Let us affirm that which is best in us and in each other through the sacrament of food. So I really want to come back to the issue of reconnection, because this is the key to how we uncolonize ourselves. You have also been given a handout in this course, in this presentation, for a specific exercise on reconnection. And I want to emphasize that we can talk about how we're going to change the system and how we're going to change business as usual. You know, we can talk until we're very old and gray, but we won't change anything until we change the nature of our connection or disconnection. Until we start working on this, we're going to remain colonized. And so I want to suggest a 3-part exercise for you to work on as soon as possible, because I don't want to take the time to do the exercise with you in this presentation, but I want to highly recommend that you do it yourself very soon. And I'm going to explain the exercise in a moment. But first I want to say that I have found that this exercise makes the reality of our disconnection from self, others, and earth very real in our lives. And my experience is that we have to feel the reality of our disconnection, or we won't be able to build resilience. If I only allow myself to see the metric of profit and success, then everything else is a blind spot. And as I said earlier, the shadow will move into that blind spot. And what that means is that this becomes a place where either consciously or unconsciously, we start betraying our connections with self, other, and earth. And as Dean Walker says, we've created a blind spot big enough to drive extinction through. Now, I want to make one thing very clear. I don't mean that as we run our businesses or our lives, we shouldn't have a business plan or any goals, or we shouldn't care about making money. What I'm saying is that allowing ourselves to transform our relationships with self, the other, and with earth, that is choosing reconnection and grace over business as usual, is going to change how we do business and what success, prosperity, and productivity ultimately mean to us. In other words, and this is the most important concept I'm sharing with you today, we need to shift our focus from outcome to presence. We need to shift our focus from outcome to presence. What does that mean? It means that we consciously engage in business from a place of deep connection with ourselves, with other, and with earth. So here's the exercise that I've made available to you as a handout from this segment of the webinar. I want to suggest that sometime within the next month, you do the following practice. Get away from people, get quiet, and spend at least 2 hours taking an inventory of how you have disconnected or are disconnecting from yourself, how you have disconnected or are disconnecting from others, how you have disconnected or are disconnecting from earth. Journal about it extensively. And whatever you discover, know that you've just scratched the surface, because this is a lifelong practice and one that we need to constantly assess. And as we regularly practice this and constantly reassess, it's going to profoundly change how we live our lives. Therefore, the end of business as usual. This is a powerful, potentially life-changing practice, and I assure you that if you diligently do this practice, taking plenty of time and really sitting with it, emotions are going to be stirred. And you might feel yourself pulled into some kind of shame or guilt or fear or frustration or grief. Just remember that all emotions are good and all need to be honored. And as we cultivate practices of reconnection, and this is certainly not the only one, there are many practices for this, but as we cultivate these practices, we realize the extent to which we've disconnected from ourselves, each other, and from earth. And over time, as we cultivate practices of reconnection, and we do this together, we begin to manifest grace and presence. Divine presence is another way of saying grace, and we begin to feel this grace in every aspect of our lives. Cultivating reconnection is also another way of deepening and strengthening integrity in our lives. Whether we've been conscious of it or not, we've been complicit in the business as usual model because we've been so pressured to shape our businesses and our careers and our life's work and even our relationships toward the end game of profit. And we override all the messages to the contrary to get there. So moving from business as usual to the business of reconnection requires extraordinary reinvention of oneself and the foundation of our lives. And it takes courage to move through the many emotions that may surface: grief, fear, disorientation, vulnerability, and more. This is hard work, and it's not for the faint of heart. On the other hand, the rewards of doing this work are beyond words and truly make a reconnected self and a reconnected world possible. And I want to say one more thing to everyone listening to me today. I want you to take a moment to check in with yourself right now and notice how you're feeling. I'm very aware that every one of us, no matter what our work in the world is, no matter what our circumstances are, we're all in some kind of pain as a result of the global crisis, which is hitting us all in some way very close to home. So if you're feeling fear, anger, sorrow, despair, whatever you're feeling right now, know that it is a natural and inevitable result of the predicament that we're all in. And I encourage you not to be alone with it. Share your feelings with someone, perhaps someone in this group. Also, I'm very happy to assist people in doing this one-day practice exercise as well as dealing with all that it opens up. I've been doing life coaching with folks on an individual coaching level for several years. And just know that today we've only scratched the surface, and hopefully when the time is right, we can go deeper together into the life-altering work of reconnection. If you'd like to contact me, you can email me at carolyn@carolynbaker.net. And one more thing, please know that the practice I've offered here is only one of many. My intention and my desire is that it will assist you in committing to a path of tool sharpening and much deeper reconnection with yourself, with others, and with Earth. One tool sharpening offering that Dean Walker and I are making available this fall is our new pilot course, Resilience Bridge, Real Tools for Real Times, which is going to be offered in Ashland, Oregon, and Boulder, Colorado in September and October. This will be a 3-day course, and you're not going to find another course like it anywhere. It's designed to teach us how to build and maintain resilience in every aspect of our lives in these daunting times. And you can learn more and register at my website, carolynbaker.net. So thank you again for your presence here. And at this point, I'm opening to hearing some comments or questions if you have them.
Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us for the Local Food Summit and offering some insight into dealing with the challenges that face us. I really appreciate your touching on the issue of colonization, because I feel that it's something that for most people we're just not aware of. You know,
right.
We're like the fish swimming in water, and we don't think of ourselves as being colonized. But when we see that the industrial food system now controls about 99% of the food supply on this planet, it's clear that we've been colonized.
Absolutely.
You know, and this is perhaps the most successful colonization program in human history.
Yes.
And
yes.
What's astonishing about it to me is that we don't think about it, we don't talk about it it's gone invisible. You know, it's silent, and so it's very, very powerful. And so one of the things we might just talk about briefly is consumerism,
Yes.
and how over the, you know, the last 60, 70 years ago, we have allowed ourselves to even define ourselves as consumers. I'm astonished at how many people easily talk of themselves as being consumers
Right.
and
Right.
never question it. And it's becoming really painful to me to hear people refer to themselves as consumers.
Yeah, and this goes back to lack of connection or lack of relationship,
Yeah.
because I'm in partnership with this food that I take in. I'm in partnership with whatever comes to me, or whatever it is that I need in my life. I don't just go out and grab it and consume it. I have a relationship, and everything is relationship, everything. But we've forgotten that, and that's why we identify as consumers.
Well, I think as we study the history of advertising and marketing since World War II, we can see that we have been carefully trained to be good consumers in this society, and to accept, our identity as such. So I woke up to the reality that consumer means economic target.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we've all been targeted, and we are every single day. And so I can never go into a Target store again without realizing what that target means.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. But it's an ongoing form of colonization.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a lot of work to do in that area of decolonizing ourselves, and so I really appreciate you bringing that forward.
Yeah, I'm very much about that we need to do both inner and outer work.
Yeah.
And of course, your movement is all about, or for the most part, about outer work and actually doing things to make this situation better, and to raise consciousness around it. And then there's the inner work, because these two travel together and need each other. And, my experience in activism is, if it's all about the work that you do out there without inner work, you're going to burn out, or in some way probably sabotage your very best efforts. So the inner has to support the outer.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and you bring that home in referencing Peter Bolin, and the way we eat is how we are. Our relationship with food is who we are.
Absolutely.
And if we think about that, that's for some of us a little bit scary.
Yeah.
But it gets down to the core of what food is really about. So part of our training as good consumers, as colonists, is that we have come to view food as a commodity, just as fuel or a source of pleasure.
Yeah.
So the sense of the sacred that is fundamental to indigenous societies around food has been lost to us. And so bringing that back, learning how to connect with food on a spiritual level, and it really is about connection with the whole, connection with our own being, connection with each other, connection with the land, connection with the cycles and processes of life.
Yes.
So connecting with all of that, becoming aware of it, and beginning to shed the consumerist overlay that we've all grown up with, uh, is life-changing.
Absolutely.
So
It
we start
absolutely
to
is.
see a life differently. It's kind of ironic because as we're awakening to all this, we're also simultaneously awakening to the predicament that we face as a species on the
Yes.
planet, which is
Yes.
really daunting. I just early this morning listened to a recent interview with Guy McPherson from, he's down in Belize. He is also going to be a presenter in the local food summit here, and just to be confronted once again with what he considers to be the relative certainty that we're facing extinction as a species by 2026. Just to take that in and to process it once again is it's certainly uncomfortable, but it seems to me it's also very useful.
Yes. I agree. I agree.
And so I sense from you, and we've talked about this in the past, but we're developing capacities for facing overwhelming challenge, even overwhelming global chaos. But in that, we are developing something, that hasn't been accessible to us
Yeah.
before. We are developing new muscles, if you
Mm-hmm.
will. We
Mm-hmm.
are building new lines of connection. But boy, it's easy along the way to lose track of all.
Yeah, it is. And it has to be a commitment to, whatever else I do, this is part of my life's work,
Yeah.
is to build this resilience, because that's what we're talking about, is resilience. And resilience is no guarantee that you're going to survive. And of course, none of us is, because life is fatal. Um, but in the time that we're here, we can build this resilience and be connected with self, others, and earth, and not only make a difference in our own lives, but make a difference in the lives of some other living beings.
Well, in some ways, I can appreciate what McPherson is saying, that if you live with the belief that we're doomed to extinction within 10 years or less, how do you live your life? Well, you live it. You live it fully present,
Yes.
which is essential anyway,
Yeah.
however much time we
Yeah.
have left. But I think it's really significant that you're talking about us building our own internal lifeboat
Yes.
for
Yes.
turbulent times. And
Yes.
of course, what we're seeing is that we need an external lifeboat as well,
You bet.
and that has to be at its core, at its fundamental base. That has to be resilient, highly localized regional food sheds.
Yes.
This is the only structure that we can see anywhere on the planet that has any possibility of serving as a lifeboat for us as a people through this very difficult transition time that we're facing.
Yes.
So we don't know how well all of that will work,
No, we do not.
but we do know that that's really the only option that we have.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yes.
our best hope for the future.
And I think an obligation, not just an option.
Yes, thank you. That's very good. So thank you, Carolyn, for the work that you're doing, and I hope people will take advantage of the opportunity to connect with you directly.
Thank you.
Explore Resilience Bridge and the work that you and Dean are doing together. And we'll make sure that your website and your contact information is available to people who've tuned in here. So thank you for your contribution to the Local Food Summit.
Thank you, Michael.